It's May 1963. A team of American climbers splits in two, hoping to plant the flag and make history. One follows the known path to Everest's summit. The other takes a route no one's ever survived. No backup, no Sherpa support, and by the time they radio for help, it's already too late. This is the story of Everest's most reckless climb and the man they left behind. Welcome to the Extreme Edge. In 1963, America was losing the Cold War in every way that mattered to the public. The Soviets had beaten us to space, they were winning the propaganda war, and then there was Everest, the world's highest mountain, and not a single American had stood on top of it. The expedition leader, a Swiss-American named Norman Dierenfurth, decided to change that. He had spent 2 years securing funding from sponsors, including National Geographic. They didn't just want Americans on Everest, they wanted photographs. Perfect, heroic photographs that would show the world true American superiority. So they assembled 19 of the best climbers in the country. But here's the thing. The core group wasn't your typical mountaineers. They came from Wyoming cowboy country, but these guys weren't cowboys. They were mountain guides, ski bums, and climbing professionals who had built a small mountaineering community in the shadow of the Tetons. They lived in A-frame lodges, ran ski shops, and spent their summers guiding wealthy clients up the Grand Teton. The other climbers called them the Teton Tribe, and they had a reputation for being different. Norman would later say hiring them was the best and worst decision he ever made. Jake Breitenbach was one of those guys. He was 27, recently married to a brilliant woman named Lou, who had a Harvard education, and he ran a small ski shop right at the base of Snow King Mountain. At the time, he was one of the best technical climbers in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, but everyone who climbed with Jake knew something was off about his relationship with mountains. It started with Mount Owen in the Tetons. Now, this was a peak that his friends could practically walk up, but Jake attempted to climb it 8 times without success. Every time, something went catastrophically wrong. Sudden storms, rock fall, equipment failure. Other guides started joking that Mount Owen had taken out a restraining order against Jake. Then, the accidents got worse. Tiny detour on this chaos train. If you want more raw, uncut stories we can't show here, come join the Extreme community on Patreon. We'll see you on the real Extreme Edge. In 1961, Jake was guiding 3 clients up the Grand Teton when his hair suddenly stood on end. Before he could react, lightning struck him directly. Not near him, the bolt actually hit him in the chest. His clients must have watched in horror as the electricity arced across his body. He flatlined for 30 seconds. When he came back, he had burn marks where the lightning entered and exited his body. Any normal person would have descended immediately. Jake finished the climb. I've been on a mountain in a lightning storm and can't imagine thinking about making the summit after something like that. His friend David Dornan once said there were stories where the mountain turned against him. Now, David wasn't some superstitious guy. He was a professional mountain guide, but even he couldn't shake the feeling that Jake was cursed. In 1962, Jake was guiding when a massive rock fell and missed him by inches. It would have killed him instantly. The client said Jake just stood there, staring at where the rock had hit, and quietly said, "It's getting closer." 3 weeks before leaving for Everest, Jake's wife, Lou, begged him not to go. She'd watched him survive lightning strikes, dodge falling rocks, and somehow walk away from accidents that should have killed him. She knew his luck with mountains, and she was terrified it would finally run out. But Jake insisted. This was the opportunity of a lifetime, the first American expedition to Everest, a chance to make history. The expedition leader had handpicked Jake and 6 other climbers from the Tetons because they were some of the best alpinists in America. How could he say no to that? He had to go. So in early March 1963, the American Mount Everest expedition began its journey. The team Norman Dierenfurth assembled was unlike anything America had ever sent to the Himalayas. 19 Americans supported by 32 Sherpas and 909 porters. carrying 27 tons of gear. From Jackson Hole came the core group: Jake Breitenbach, Dick Ponel, Barry Bishop, Dave Dingman, and Willi Unsoeld. From other parts of the country came equally formidable climbers: James Big Jim Whittaker, a towering 6'5" store manager whose confidence was absolute; Tom Hornbein, a physician from Missouri; Lute Jersted, an Oregon teacher. Each man was selected not just for his climbing ability, but for his character under extreme stress. Their plan was ambitious beyond anything previously attempted on Everest. While most expeditions focused on a single route, Norman planned a 2-route assault. The main team would follow the proven South Col route. Meanwhile, a smaller group would attempt the unconquered West Ridge, a route considered impossible. No one had tried it and lived. The team flew to Kathmandu and began the long trek to Everest. For 2 weeks, they walked through Nepal's valleys and villages, gradually gaining altitude. On March 14th, they reached Tengbache Monastery at 12,700 feet. It was here that Jake sat down and wrote a letter to his wife, Lou. In it, he described eating wild goat and drinking chang with Sherpa families. He talked about the carefree life of a young adventurer in an exotic place that few Americans had ever seen. But then, Jake wrote something that still gives me chills. We've been divided into 2 groups now, one for the South Col and the other for an attempt on the West Ridge. Barry and I are both on the West Ridge and happy about it. Attempting this route reduces our chance of climbing the mountain at all and makes it most unlikely that any of us going on the West Ridge will see the summit. Nevertheless, the opportunity of trying a new route cannot be passed up. He closed the letter as afternoon clouds rolled in. I probably won't have another chance to write until base camp. I miss you very much. Love, Jake. Jake sealed the letter and gave it to a runner who would carry it back to Kathmandu. Then he shouldered his pack and continued the trek toward Everest. On March 20th, the team established their base camp at 17,800 feet on the Kumbu Glacier, 1 month earlier than any previous expedition. Above them loomed their first major obstacle, the Kumbu Icefall. The Sherpa climbers regard this part as the most dangerous section of Everest, and there's a reason for that. It's exactly what it sounds like, a frozen waterfall of death. Imagine house-sized blocks of ice stacked on top of each other like a giant Jenga game, except the blocks are constantly shifting, cracking, and collapsing without warning. Crevasses open up that are so deep you can't see the bottom. Ice towers called seracs lean at impossible angles, held up by nothing but physics and luck. Every climber who's ever been to Everest will tell you the same thing. The Kumbu Icefall is where many people die, right there in that twisted maze of ice at the bottom of the mountain. The team spent 2 days preparing their route through the Icefall. Unlike modern expeditions that use aluminum ladders, they had to improvise with ropes, wooden planks, and whatever they could find. But finally, on the morning of March 23rd, it was the expedition's first real climbing day. Perfect conditions, clear skies. The temperature was just below freezing. Jake was roped to Dick Ponel, another Wyoming guide. They were following a route that Sherpas had marked with flags the day before. At 10:30 a.m., they were making their way through a particularly unstable section when they heard it. Now, if you've never heard a glacier collapse, it's not like anything else on Earth. It starts as this deep crack, like the planet itself is breaking in half, and then it becomes this thunderous roar that fills the entire valley. Jake has maybe 2 seconds to look up and see this tower of ice, taller than a 3-story house, tilting toward him like a falling skyscraper. And in that moment, he knows. He absolutely knows what's about to happen. There's nowhere to run. And then, what you're probably expecting happened. The mountain took Jake. The ice came down like the fist of an angry mythical creature. Tons and tons of compressed snow and ice, moving faster than a freight train. Jake Breitenbach simply vanished. 1 second he was there, and the next second he was gone. His teammates frantically started digging where they thought he might be, but it was hopeless. The twisted orange nylon of Jake's climbing rope disappeared under tons of debris. They dug for 6 hours until their hands were raw and bleeding, but there was nothing. Jake was entombed somewhere under that chaos of ice and snow, vaporized. They had no choice but to cut the rope and leave their friend behind. The team at base camp held a memorial service that night. The Sherpas burned juniper and chanted. The Americans mostly sat in stunned silence. Several climbers wrote in their journals that Jake's death felt inevitable, like the mountain had finally collected a debt. They voted to continue the expedition, and that is probably exactly what Jake would have wanted. Back in Jackson Hole, Lou Breitenbach was anxiously checking the mail every day. She knew Jake would write when he could. He always did. But ever since he'd left, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She kept thinking about what he'd told her 3 weeks before leaving. See, Jake had a secret. He'd been having the same nightmare every night before the expedition. In the dream, he was buried in ice, trying to claw his way out. But every time he got close to the surface, more ice would crash down on him. "I don't think I'm coming back from Everest," he had told her. So when the telegram bearing the bad news finally arrived, deep down, Lou already knew. Jake's dream had come true in the most horrifying way possible. He was buried under tons of ice, just like he'd seen night after night. The mountain had been calling for him all along. It would be 40 painful years before Lou would feel strong enough to tell this story to the world. But Jake's death was just the beginning. So Jake is buried under tons of ice, and his teammates are devastated. But Jake's death did something to the Wyoming climbers. It transformed their grief into an almost reckless determination. They weren't just going to climb Everest anymore. They were going to do it the hardest way possible, as if the mountain had thrown down a challenge by taking their friend. Remember when I told you they wanted to attempt climbing Everest through the West Ridge? Here's something I didn't tell you. At the time, this was a very controversial option. In fact, most climbers thought the West Ridge efforts would eventually fail anyway. It's easy to see why. The West Ridge was basically a death sentence disguised as a climbing route. You had all the usual nightmares. 7,678 feet of unexplored mountain above their advanced base camp, snowfields that could avalanche without warning, a massive couloir that funneled rocks like a bowling alley, and an unavoidable band of yellow rock that looked impossible to climb. But on top of all that, they'd have to cross illegally into China during the height of the Cold War, when getting caught could mean being shot as American spies. Most importantly, the team leadership hated this plan. The West Ridge climbers were denied resources, supplies, and even encouragement. The South Col faction voted to keep Sherpas for their own push, since they had the best shot at making history. Although they were eventually supplied with supplemental oxygen, and the expedition leader finally greenlit their summit bid once it was clear they were not backing down, they were basically on their own. Meanwhile, the South Col team was making steady progress on the proven route. This was the path Hillary and Tenzing had taken in 1953. Still incredibly dangerous, but at least it was known territory. The team methodically established camps up the Lhotse face, fixing ropes and hauling supplies. By April 26th, they had reached the South Col at approximately 26,900 feet, well ahead of schedule. On April 27th, Jim Whittaker and Nwang Gombu left for their summit attempt. They established Camp 6 at about 28,000 feet on April 30th. The weather was perfect. Clear skies, minimal wind. Everything was aligning for America's moment. On the morning of May 1st, 1963, Whittaker and Gombu left camp at 6 a.m. Step by agonizing step, they climbed higher than any American had ever been. By 11:30 a.m., Jim Whittaker, all 6'5" of him, took his final steps and stood on top of the world. America had done it. For the first time in history, an American stood at 29,028 feet, the highest point on Earth. Whittaker pulled out a 3x5-foot American flag and planted it in the snow. The stars and stripes whipped violently in the jet stream winds. He and Gombu embraced, pounded each other on the back, and radioed the incredible news to base camp. "Big Jim did it," crackled across the radio. The entire base camp erupted. Men who hadn't cried since childhood wept openly. They hugged, they cheered, they danced. America was finally on top of Everest. When news reached the States 2 days later, it made front-page headlines across the country. President Kennedy himself sent a letter congratulating the team. After years of Soviet victories in the space race, America had finally won something. But even as they celebrated, the West Ridge team made up of Teton professionals Barry Corbett, Willi Unsoeld, Tom Hornbein, Dick Ponel, and Dave Dingman pressed forward anyway. By now, they were driven by something deeper than logic or safety. They were carrying Jake's memory with them, and they were determined to honor his sacrifice by attempting something extraordinary. Between April 16th and May 13th, these 5 men hauled nearly all their supplies up the West Ridge by hand, breathing thin air, struggling under loads approaching 60 pounds each. They'd initially tried a winch system to hoist gear up steep sections, but it proved useless at high altitude, so they did it the hard way, one back-breaking load at a time. On May 14th, Willi and Tom began their final preparations. They established Camp 4 on the west shoulder at around 25,100 feet. The next day, they reached the foot of a steep, narrow gully, a sheer cut in the mountain's face. Then, disaster struck. On the night of May 16th, hurricane-force winds slammed into Camp 4. Tom and Willi spent a terrifying night holding tent poles with frozen fingers, desperately preventing their tent from tearing apart and blowing off the mountain. By dawn, their tent was shredded, and much of their gear was damaged or lost. Any sane person would have retreated immediately, but they didn't. They salvaged whatever gear remained intact and pressed on. By May 19th, time was running out. The expedition was supposed to be wrapping up. Since Whittaker's summit on May 1st, no other Americans had reached the top. Base Camp was pressuring the West Ridge team to abandon their attempt. But Norman Deerenfurth had an idea. On the South Col route, 2 climbers, Barry Bishop and Luke Gersted, were also in position for a summit attempt. What if they coordinated? The plan was, on May 22nd, Bishop and Gersted would go for the summit from the South Col, while Hornbein and Unsoeld attempted from the West Ridge the same day. If both teams succeeded and could meet on the summit, they'd complete the first traverse of Everest up one side, down the other. It was an audacious plan. No mountain this high had ever been traversed, but it would cement America's dominance on Everest, not just reaching the top, but conquering it from 2 different routes on the same day. The plan they settled on was basically an impossible mission disguised as a climbing strategy. Hornbein and Unsoeld would establish a tiny 2-person camp at 27,250 feet. And when I say tiny, I mean an 18-inch wide ledge carved into the mountain below. Basically, these guys were going to sleep on a shelf of ice barely wider than their bodies, suspended over a 10,000-foot drop at an altitude where your brain can barely function. From there, they would make a single-day push to the summit, then descend via the South Col route. There was no backup plan. If they couldn't make it over the mountain, they didn't have enough supplies to retreat back down the West Ridge. It was summit or die. So, on May 21st, 5 Sherpas helped Tom and Willi to their final camp. These Sherpas, tough mountain people who had seen climbers come and go, said goodbye like they were attending a funeral. They knew the odds. That night, at 27,250 feet, Tom and Willi ate a 4-person ration of chicken and rice soup. They were trying to carb load for what would likely be the most demanding day of their lives. Every calorie was precious. They barely slept. How could you? You're lying on a camp 20,000 feet in the air, breathing air so thin it feels like drowning, and knowing that in a few hours you'll either make history or die trying. They woke up at 4 a.m. on May 22nd. The weather was perfect. Clear skies, minimal wind. These were the conditions they'd been praying for. They put on their crampons, metal spikes that bite into ice, and left camp just before 7 a.m., roped together for what they knew was a one-way journey into the unknown. By noon, they reached the upper flanks of the mountain, but they were completely disoriented, which isn't surprising. At 28,000 feet, their brains are oxygen-starved, and they're in terrain no human had ever seen before. They couldn't figure out which way led to the summit, so they did something that would be unthinkable today. They radioed down to base camp and asked for directions. While this sounds funny, it shows just how lost they were, and there was no guide to rescue them here. If they failed to reach the summit, death was certain. As the day wore on, Willi and Tom's situation became desperate. They were climbing much slower than expected because the route was harder than anyone had imagined. The rock was loose and dangerous. Their oxygen was running low. Worst of all, they were running out of daylight. For hours and hours they continued to climb until, at 6:15 p.m., way too late to be summiting Everest, they finally saw it. The American flag, whipping in the wind against a darkening sky. They had done it. They had reached the summit of the tallest mountain in the world through Everest's West Ridge, something most experts thought was impossible. It was, quite frankly, one of the greatest feats of mountaineering at the time. But here's where their story gets even more incredible and more terrifying. Remember the coordinated plan? Both teams would summit on May 22nd and meet on top and then climb down together. It was a good plan, a solid plan, and it was about to be tested in the worst possible way. First, Bishop and Unsoeld summited right on schedule at 3:30 p.m. They planted a flag, took pictures, celebrated, and waited. They waited for 45 minutes. They scanned the West Ridge for any sign of Tom and Willi. Nothing. The sun was getting lower. They had to start climbing down. Meanwhile, Tom and Willi were still fighting their way up the West Ridge, hours behind schedule. When they finally stumbled onto the summit at 6:15 p.m., they were exhausted but elated. They'd done the impossible. They saw Bishop and Unsoeld's flag and knew the first part of the plan had worked. Now, for the second part, descending down the South Col route, a route they'd never seen before, in the dark, with almost no oxygen left. Here's the thing, though. Tom and Willi weren't worried. The plan had a safety net. If the teams couldn't meet on the summit, climbers from Camp 6 would come up with lights and extra oxygen to guide the West Ridge team down as they slowly descended. It was all arranged. What could go wrong? So they started down from the summit at around 6:35 p.m. Within minutes, Willi's oxygen ran out completely. Still not worried, the sun was setting, painting the Himalayas blood red before plunging them into darkness. Still, they weren't worried. They were stumbling down unfamiliar terrain as the darkness grew all around them, but they were still not worried. At around 7:30 p.m., they reached the south summit, which is about 28,700 feet. But as they're rappelling down in the gathering darkness, anxiety slowly starts rising. They've come this far and met no one. It's at this point that it slowly began to dawn on both climbers. Something's gone wrong. Where's the support team? Where are the other climbers who were supposed to help guide them down? Scared and confused, Willi switched on his headlamp one last time, probably just to get a look at his surroundings in the growing darkness. And in that moment, he saw something that made his heart leap. Tracks illuminated in the snow ahead. Thank God. Footprints, he thought. Footprints meant safety. Footprints meant they weren't alone. They could still survive this nightmare. So Tom and Willi started following the footprints downward, moving as quickly as their battered bodies would let them. They started shouting into the darkness, hoping someone, anyone, would hear them and guide them down. That's when they heard voices shouting back, but the voices weren't coming from below at Camp 6. They were coming from somewhere on the ridge below. It turned out the voices belonged to Bishop and Unsoeld. Now, this made no sense. Bishop and Unsoeld had summited hours earlier. They were supposed to be waiting at Camp 6 with hot drinks and extra oxygen. Instead, they were still on the mountain. Here's what had gone catastrophically wrong. After summiting, Bishop's body had started shutting down. 14 hours of climbing had pushed him past his limit. He kept collapsing, literally falling unconscious while walking. Unsoeld was practically dragging him down the mountain with him. So, although they should have been back at camp hours ago, darkness had trapped them on the ridge. At around 9:30 p.m., the four men finally found each other in the darkness. Bishop was barely conscious. Only Tom had any oxygen left because his regulator had malfunctioned earlier, and they were still hours from safety. It was at this moment that it hit Tom and Willi. The plan had fallen completely apart. There would be no help from Camp 6, not because no one was there, but how could they climb up in pitch darkness to find four lost climbers? So now you have all 4 Americans stranded in the death zone. No shelter, almost no oxygen, and it's 28,000 feet up, where the temperature is minus 18 degrees. Tom gave energy pills to Bishop and Gersted, hoping to keep them alert as the 4 reunited climbers tried to carefully make their way down as a team. But it changed nothing. By 12:30 a.m., they'd made almost no progress. They were exhausted, making dangerous mistakes in the darkness, and Bishop kept losing consciousness. What happened next was the closest thing to a death pact you'll ever hear about. After deliberating for a moment, all 4 climbers decided to sit down on a ledge, rest, and basically spend the night completely exposed at 28,000 feet. Let me put this in perspective. Spending a night exposed at that altitude should have killed all 4 of them. Simple as that. The cold dropped to negative 18 degrees Fahrenheit, but the mountain gave them one gift that saved their lives. The wind stayed completely calm. If there had been even a moderate breeze, the wind chill would have killed them in minutes. They huddled together as a group, taking turns keeping each other awake, because if you fall asleep at that altitude, there's a good chance you won't wake up. Their feet were freezing solid inside their boots. Every minute that passed was another minute closer to death. I can't even imagine the mental strength it took to survive that night. These men were fighting off hypothermia, hypoxia, and exhaustion while clinging to a mountain that was trying to kill them, and they did it for hours through the longest night of their lives. Thankfully, at 4 a.m., the first hint of light appeared on the eastern horizon. They had survived the night that should have been impossible to survive. But when they tried to stand up, the damage became clear. Bishop couldn't feel his feet at all. Willi's toes were white and hard. All 4 men moved like they'd aged 20 years overnight. The next day, support climbers at Camp 6, climbing up with emergency oxygen, raced to meet them. They'd been expecting to find 4 dead bodies. Instead, they found 4 survivors who had just accomplished something that medical experts said was impossible: surviving an unprotected night in the death zone. The cost would become clear over the following days. Barry Bishop would lose all 10 toes and parts of 2 fingers. Willi Unsoeld would lose 9 toes. And here's something that shows you what kind of guy he was. He actually preserved them in a jar and would show them off to his students back home. 19 toes between them. That was the cost of making history. But they had done something incredible. They had completed the first traverse of Mount Everest, climbing up the impossible West Ridge and descending the standard route. It was a mountaineering achievement that redefined what was possible in the vertical world. What I do know is that Jake's courage to keep climbing despite his history of bad luck and his teammates' determination to honor his memory by choosing the harder path reminds me how heroic humans can be. Jake's shadow never left that glacier. Every crampon bite the team took above the icefall echoed his last unspoken warning. Yet, they pushed on anyway, threading a line between courage and tragedy so thin it could have been a climbing rope frayed to a single strand. So when you wonder why they kept climbing after that mountain claimed its toll, remember this: greatness is almost always purchased on credit, and Everest sends the bill in lives, limbs, and legend. Call it reckless, call it heroic. Either way, the summit still stands, daring the rest of us to decide what we're willing to gamble for a shot at immortality. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Stay bold and live brave.